of culture that's underneath the apparent superficial diversity, the apparent diversity that is very superficial. What is really important is the cultural deep structure, and we could go on and on about that, but that is really a key point. And it's not only true on the continent of Africa, it's true of African people wherever they are, including in the Western diaspora, including in the United States of America.
These two dances developed at two different times in two different continents.
That's why culture becomes very important. That's why people cannot tell us that culture, is something that, it's important, but don't worry about it. It is important. Because if our children are to succeed, they have got to have a positive sense of who they are, who they have been, so that they will know what they can be.
People used to think of culture as, say, the spirit of a society, the basic ideas and symbols and things of that sort. Okay, that is one sort of standard intellectual view of culture. Second view of culture, especially pushed by the anthropologists, was a little bit broader and basically thinks of culture as the way of life of a people, which includes their material objects, their arts, but also their customs. So that's a very mixed bag.
After this, your first question is, what is culture, or what is a working definition of culture? For the purposes of this segment of African American Culture, a second look, let's just call culture whatever you can learn.
In this edition of our 10-part series, we're going to examine the assumptions most of us make about culture. Can a people deprived of native language and forced to shed traditional lifestyles retain any vestige of their original heritage? Traditional scientific research says no, and they point to what they see as an absolute separation between black Americans and traditional African culture. But there's a volume of information to dispute those claims. The black fraternity step routines you just saw clearly mimic traditional South African boot dances. While this example may seem like a coincidence to some, California psychologist Dr. Wade Noble says it's one of many instances where blacks in America have kept or tapped into their African roots almost subconsciously.
Because culture is a mental process, and what happened in our trek to the New World is that we were prohibited from engaging in certain behavioral practices, but the psychology or the mentality of African people never was destroyed. In fact, part of the intellectual theoretical community tries to talk about the transmission of information, likes to talk about information be transmitted overtly and intentionally from one generation to the next, where in the African tradition you have to evaluate people from their cultural spirit or space.
For the last 200 years, traditional historians had two premises about African American culture. First, most history and sociology books teach us slavery destroyed all cultural ties black Americans had to Africa. Most historians would also have us believe that African culture existed in an uncivilized and undeveloped environment before the Europeans came. Both tenets of traditional wisdom are wrong. In the next half hour, we'll show you sophisticated pre-European African cultures which had wealth, respect, writing, commerce, and governments organizing the lives of millions of people. To contradict the theory black Americans lost all African culture as slaves, we'll examine linguistic, social, and musical research from Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, and Dr. Asa Hilliard. One of the most obvious areas to see black Americans' ties to Africa comes from linguistics. If we compare black American dialect with some dominant West African languages, we see an amazing amount of often overlooked cultural continuity.
And we know that when African people were brought to this country, we were not sat down in a classroom at Atlanta University and taught how to speak the King's English. We had to pick it up as we could pick it up. And so we have African people taking in this new language, this English language, and adapting it to the way that they spoke, their traditional ways of speaking.
FT, ST, SKLD, and the suffix ING. In the English language, these consonant clusters are distributed. In West African language, they are not. Therefore, in African American languages, words like drift, swift, and left will be drift, swift, and left.
But as more Black American scholars begin to see similarities, more of the ties to African culture start to fit. Some of them seem very obvious, as Ebonics specialist Dr. Ernie Smith explained during this 1979 PBS interview in San Diego.
Relexification is a process of acquiring or restructuring a language. In the case of the English language, we have an example here of some languages having a verb system that is aspectual and some having a tense system. In this particular case, we have the Latin ego amo tu, which the English equivalent would be I love you, but the verb order, subject, verb, object, is not Latin. So relexification has occurred for African speech in that you won't find a copular verb. She, gone. We don't have a verb to expressly predicate present tense. He, they, mine. Whose are these? They, mine. There's no verb to be.
No possessive state.
No possessive or copular verb, as they're called in linguistics.
In 1979, when few people knew about Ebonics, the study of African American speech, in 1989, Black scholars have moved forward from the richness and wisdom of African oral traditions. Now they've started to dismiss the calculated inaccuracies spread about the intelligence of African slaves. Most of us have learned those slaves came to the New World unable to write. That's not true. They may not have known how to speak or write English, but many spoke several languages and knew how to write in their native tongues.
If you saw a people's writing, and you were told that they had no writing, you would call it decoration. If you saw Chinese being written and you did not know this was a formal language, you would indeed say, oh, they do good decoration.
What proof do we have to support these claims? Well, the writings themselves.
Well, let me just show you Nsibidi, Mende, the Moom script from the Cameroons, the Vai script from Liberia, and the Bete script from the Ivory Coast. And it's important to expose students to all these different writing systems, because that destroys the myth that African people had no systems of writing, that African people did not write. It's a myth. It's a lie.
Mrs. Harris wrote the essay on literature for Portland, Oregon's groundbreaking research on African studies. You can read part of that research in the Portland Baseline Essays. This project took almost a decade to develop and now used by Atlanta schools in their infusion program. During her research on writing, Mrs. Harris looked at Black Americans' cultural linguistic ties to West Africa. But while doing that research, she discovered possible ties the writing in West Africa may have to East Africa, specifically the land of Kemet, which most of us know by its Greek name, Egypt.
Here you have the Nsibidi script on your right, and then you have the Egyptian script on the left. Look at the similarities. Look at them. Comparison between the Egyptian script and the Tolma signs. Look at the similarities. See, when you look at stuff like this, then it becomes very hard for people to tell you that, well, Egypt was isolated. Egypt was not a part of Africa. The Mende signs. This is Vi. the moon. You know, what's so interesting, some of them are identical.
As we have explained in earlier segments of this series, the original people to live in Kemet didn't look like the residents there today. The faces of the pharaohs, their own written description of themselves as black people of the black land, and extensive research by scholars such as Dr. Asa Hilliard means the people we show you now may have had their descendants brought to the Americas as slaves. By now it's fairly obvious you can't talk about African American culture without having accurate facts about African history. But it gets hard to talk about contributions if no one knows what they are.
Have you ever studied Africa?
No.
No. Not at all?
No. No. But I have studied Switzerland.
Have you studied China?
No.
Have you studied Mexico?
Few Americans, black or white, realized the African continent had thriving city-states, trade routes, governments, and kingdoms before the Europeans came.
But information does exist which helps us understand African continuity with African American continuity. Books such as this by Richard Hall. In African Cities and Towns Before the European Conquest, Hall gives us pictures, documentation, and more specifically, information about African lifestyles, some of those habits and pieces of culture we see in African Americans today.
Salaga, Gayo, Segu, all large pre-European African towns. Some grew on the banks of the Niger River. Others supported populations of about 400,000, and this according to European accounts. West African market cities such as Janneh and Gayo were wealthy and prosperous, with residents buying and selling gold in 1596. Two of these towns were probably founded somewhere around 822 to 921 AD. Travelers from Europe and other places describe the inhabitants as exceedingly rich, and the cities stood as homes for many doctors, judges, priests, and learned men. This type of praise also denotes a high standard of learning during what we call Europeans' Dark Ages.
When Europe was having its Dark Ages, there were no Dark Ages in the rest of the world. Africans was having an age of enlightenment, the Chinese were having an age of enlightenment, and the people of India was having an age of enlightenment. We have a tendency to take European terminology and stretch it across the whole world. But there were no comparable Dark Ages in the rest of the world until the European came.
Okay.
The European came out of his Dark Age and created a Dark Age for the rest of the world by the destruction of their civilization.
Again, accurate research supports these claims. Internationally respected author and African scholar Dr. Ivan van Sertima says, for centuries, Africans surpassed Europeans in many areas. He says as late as the 1800s, Europeans came to the Africans to learn advanced techniques in science, medicine, and antibiotics.
They also observed the cleanness with which they cut the abdomen. They observed how they collapsed the abdominal wall. They observed how they stitched. They observed also that the African surgeons with consummate skill used the cautery iron in such a way that they could stop internal bleeding during the operation almost instantly with minor tissue damage using the hot irons. And all this was brought back. It was described in great detail. It was drawn and brought back into Europe.
Again, give me the year and give me the civilization that used these advanced medical techniques.
This was observed by a team that went out towards the end of the 1870s. Somewhere around 1878 that it was published in the Edinburgh Medical Journal. It was on the team Dr. Felkin from Britain and Scotland, a joint British-Scottish team. It was observed among the Banyuro.
Now, at the beginning of this program, we defined culture as whatever you can learn. Using that definition, the ancient Africans were a very cultured people before the Europeans came. Learning and libraries held a great deal of importance to these people.
There were books, formal books, parchment, papyrus books, thousands of them along the Nile and the temples At Timbuktu, you had formal books, bound books like we know books to be.
But how did all of this information get lost, and why did it happen? Psychologist Naeem Akbar offers this explanation.
We came to America as a free people. In order for us to become slaves, it was necessary to destroy our consciousness of ourselves as independent human beings. That process was one by which you begin to destroy and to degrade those things which give you your sense of identity, purpose, direction, and origin. And in the process of doing so, you create a slave mind rather than a freed mind. And a constant onslaught of misinformation about who the slaves were was done intentionally for the purpose of making the slaves submissive and subject to the leadership of those authorities over them.
Much of Africa's history is wrapped around the glory of her kings, from the kingdoms of Kemet to the majesty of Mali and Songhai. African history developed around documented men and women. It's a comment about the power of racism and Western education that we rarely hear about these people or their countries. Who were some of these kings and queens? Dr. John Henrik Clark is a living library of resources in this area.
We know that Ghana lasted until 1000s. In the last of its many great kings, Tenkameni was killed 2 years before the Muslim invasion, 1076. So that means Tenkameni lasted until 1074. He was known as the king who rode out every day, twice a day. He would ride out and administer justice one part of the day. And no one had to move from his presence until he was satisfied that justice had been done in his case. He would ride out at the end of the day with dogs with gold collars, horses better dressed than the then kings of Europe, in splendid regalia.
At this point, we should let you know a little about the geography of ancient Africa. Ghana didn't have the boundaries it has today. In fact, according to Dr. Clark, none of present-day Ghana was a part of ancient Ghana. Dr. Clark says the boundaries of ancient Ghana look something like this. Again, we need to realize these kingdoms governed millions of people and had wealth. Wealth usually denotes commerce. Dr. Rosalind Jeffrey says the ancient Africans may have come up with the world's first calculator system to handle their daily transactions.
The old system in the marketplace was to put these little digits in a pan, and you would have your client come to you, buying, purchasing perhaps little groupings of materials, a dozen of this or 2 dozen, etc. And meanwhile, someone takes away a dozen and this, that, and the other. Meanwhile, you're moving your disc around in a pan or in a basket. And so as you're moving around, they become your way of counting. So that modern society, we have our little hand calculator, right, with a little battery inside. And the old days, you know, ancient Mali, Ghana, Songhai, etc., they had a little basket where they were shuffling around little metal discs and at the same time, you know, doing their calculations this way.
As all worldly kingdoms do, Ghana began to decline. But as that happened, the neighboring country of Mali began to rise. Dr. Clark says Mali produced some of the greatest kings in world history.
After Sunday Atta, there was a servant king, Sakuru. And after Sakuru, the greatest of all the kings of Mali, Mansa Musa. And he came to power in 1306. In 1324, he went on a famous journey to Mecca and Medina because he was a Muslim. He spent all those years preparing. He took with him from 60 to 100,000 people, 50 hairdressers, and he only had his favorite wives.
How many of them?
Only the favorite wives went on the trip. They had 50 hairdressers.
Oh,
so you can guess how many wives were there. Now you talking about style. Now when we had it, baby.
Okay, so he left basically from northern Central Africa, is that correct?
Yes.
And then went all the way into Mecca.
Went to Egypt first, where he was crowned the great caliph of the Western Sudan. I mean, it's equivalent to Pope.
Right.
Then he went over to Mecca and Medina to pay his respects and gave alms and food and, you know, in fact, he took with him 250 camels, each with 250 pounds of gold each.
To give away?
To give away. And when he got back to Egypt, he was a little short of gold. They put the entire treasure at his disposal. So you good for it. Take what you need.
Oh, man.
This is just for the trip home.
Did he marry into cities along the way?
He married his people, 50 of his people, into cities along the way, on his way. And on his way back, he said, we should not fight now because we're relatives. So it was a mission of peace. Now, this is no ordinary king. So no ordinary homecoming present is good for him. So while he was away, his local army captured the neighboring country.
Which was?
Sangay. And gave him the country as a homecoming present.
That's amazing.
Now Timbuktu is under his control.
Which means the great libraries.
Not only the library of Timbuktu, but the great mosque at Sankore that he's going to turn into the University of Sankore.
And all of this is done by Africans, not Arabs.
No Arabs in sight.
We had African scholars. And once again, it's important to know the history because at this time, Islam had taken a stronghold particularly in parts of West Africa. So you had African scholars who had Arabic names in much the same way that we have European names. It doesn't mean we're not black, that we're not of African descent because we have European names. There are reasons why we have European names. But when we look into the history and we see somebody called Ahmed Baba, don't automatically assume that Ahmed Baba looks like the Egyptians that are in Egypt today. Ahmed Baba looked like you. Okay? We need to understand that.
Ms. Harris said it's important for school children to know about educated Africans such as Ahmed Baba. She also says it's important to remember that people such as Baba had their books destroyed.
They destroyed libraries. Ahmed Baba had a library, a personal library, that had over 1,600 books. It was destroyed.
Probably one of the saddest things about the loss of African culture is that many Africans don't even recognize things that are part of their history.
Dr. Rosalind Jeffries says the ancient Africans carried these containers filled with writings and sayings. They were scriptures and parables important to them. So you could say they quite literally carried the written word on their hearts. Dr. Jeffries' research has uncovered slave diaries. These books were discounted as memorization or pre-written Arabic script, but they're not. It's also not uncommon to find another obvious vestige of Black America's often overlooked African heritage, the call and response.
Call and response is a freedom of speech in its purest form. Every amen, each, teach now, sister, take your time. Every one of those right-ons, even the negative shake of the head, and if no more than the lift of that hand that goes back and forth, register that the response is there. Each response shapes and colors the call. This is a process that empowers all of us. And I'm going to tell you something. It's far less expensive than opinion polls. Now, you may have noticed that in certain settings, the dynamics of call and response is overlooked or misinterpreted. For example, white American moviegoers have been known to complain that the Bloods talk back to the movie screen. We sure do. Even after centuries of an aborted attempt to assimilate all that is our culture. After centuries of misinformation, we African Americans still respond to the right calls.
The more accurate information gathered, the more likely it becomes to see cultural continuity for all African peoples. Unity in traditional black church services, where the call and response of songs echo back to the praise and response shouted before great African kings as they moved among their people.
I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad. All right, you got, let's do it now.
We were in a strange land. We had been snatched from our homeland, raped of our culture, cut off from all that was familiar to us. But down there in the canebrake in the Brush Arbor, we continued to sing and moan and chant for freedom on the rhythm forms and musical idioms that were familiar to us from Mother Africa. Once we were introduced to this new language, we developed what has been called the Pidgin English of the slaves. And on those rhythm forms and musical idioms, after being introduced to this Jesus person, we developed that baseline music art form called the African American spiritual.
That old time religion on Monday I got. That old time religion. I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad.
It's easy to show you comparisons of African cultural continuity in speech and writing and music. It's harder to compare social continuity in African American culture, but it does exist. Following some of the theories he gave us at the beginning of the program, Dr. Wade Nobles says many actions and gestures blacks take for granted actually show cultural continuity. Nobles also says that when a black woman puts her hand on her hip, she makes a gesture of righteousness that may date back to African culture as it was 5,000 years ago.
And we understand that that's intent that we can see in the grammar of our behavior. Isn't it interesting that this sign is the Mason Square? And in ancient Kemet, in the hieroglyphs, this sign represented righteousness. And so when sister puts her hand on her hip, she ain't just saying I got big hips and I can rest it here, even though that is true. She, in fact, is saying that there's a question of you being correct. You understand? And when she puts both hands on her hips, she's saying you doubly incorrect. You see? And so all we can say is, hey, I'm sorry. That's the sign. That's beginning to read and understand the intent of content. The content is the hands.
Africans are the only group of people who had to hide their heritage and who had the dominant society spend centuries trying to destroy that heritage. While some of that destruction did strip away surface ties, we hope the information presented in this half hour allows you to see all African culture did not die.
We know that African Americans, or African people, when they were brought to America, they weren't allowed to bring their cultural artifacts. They weren't allowed to bring the drum. They weren't allowed to bring the clothing. They weren't allowed to bring many things. But what they did bring, they were able to carry it in their minds and in their hearts. They were able to carry the rhythms. They were able to bring the stories. They were able to bring the patterns of speech. All of this we carried with us. And many people would like us to believe that once we were herded onto slave ships, that we left that on the seashore, on the shores of Africa. And that is so untrue. And when we look around us every day, we see remnants of our culture.
Earlier we showed you examples of Egyptian hieroglyphics and showed you similarities seen in West African scripts. These scripts suggest that African peoples may have migrated from the east to the west of the continent and beyond. We'll discuss those migrations and explain why they occurred in the next edition of African American Culture, A Second Look.
I ask you, my children, what did you learn today? Did anyone tell you how to meet tomorrow? Did anyone tell you why there are people who don't know you? Did anyone seem to know who you were? Did anyone know that you have the blood of Africa in your veins? Or did they pretend to be blind to your color and thereby deny its value? What did you learn? Did anyone explain the nature of freedom? Did anyone explain the nature of racism? Did anyone explain the nature of love? Did anyone know anything about these things? Did anybody know anything? What did you learn today?
And you go off in the bush, and all of a sudden you run into this little group of people they call Negrillos. How did they get there? You go to Guam, and you find a little group of people called Chimoros, little Moors. How did they get there? You go into Vietnam, and you find these black people in Vietnam. How did they get there? And you go off in the bush, and all of a sudden you run into this little group of people they call Negrillos. How did they get there? You go to Guam, and you find a little group of people called Chimoros, little Moors. How did they get there? You go into Vietnam, and you find these black people in Vietnam. How did they get there? How did the people get on the island of Fiji? How did they get to Australia? How did they get to Mexico and Central America before Columbus? You see, so the question of the movement, you see, the image of African people as movers on their own independent steam is not a part of the picture that we painted of African people. But it's counter to the fact, because the fact is that African people were the first migrants in the first place.
You're listening to some of the sounds of Africa from Brazil, Tobago,
it's a long time coming, never see you. Come, let me hold your hand.
and in America. Now we want you to see some of the sons and daughters of Africa in Russia, in the Philippines, and in the royal history of England. Some of these faces and places might surprise you. That's because most of our history books and many of our educators want you to believe that Africans only left Africa because of European slavery. Nothing could be further from the truth.
No people ever migrated as much as Africans. When Eric the Red went into Iceland, he found black people. He reported it. The Vikings found blacks among them, Thorhall the hunter, Thorstein. Africans among the Vikings. When the Romans attacked Britain, they found Africans. They said there were people as dark as Ethiopians among the fair-skinned Britons.
But more than that, if Africans had not left their continent of origin, Europeans, Asians, and the entire world's population would not exist.
This is one way that our thinking has changed over the years, that we used to think that we had to explain why it is that blacks are black. Well, now we realize that it makes perfectly good sense for people who live in Africa to be black, and what we need to explain is why are whites white.
As we discussed in part 3 of this series, the first Africans, who were also the first people, began to populate Europe and the rest of the world thousands of years ago as Homo erectus. During segment 3 of this video series, we also explained items number 1 and 2 of Dr. Hilliard's 10 points in African history. Those migrations, starting with Homo erectus, is an era we'll call the first wave of African migrations. It essentially planted humanity. For the second major wave of African migration, we must move forward several thousand years to the Egyptian Empire. According to Dr. Hilliard and Dr. Van Sertima, the people of Kemet, which we know by its Greek name Egypt, held the Khoikhoi of southern Africa in high esteem. Modern science tells us these Khoikhoi, or San people, were the world's first Homo sapiens sapiens, or modern men. The Kamites also claim they came from the mountains of the moon, either an area near Uganda or Kenya. Dr. Ivan van Sertima says it's an idea that now has some scientific support.
We had thought, and Chancellor Williams and even I had said in our books, that it's an Afro-Asiatic language. Now we have proof beyond any question that the Egyptian language is not Afro-Hamitic or Afro-Asiatic or Afro-Semitic or Afro-anything. It is fundamentally African. Those elements that came in later from other places and other peoples, those are surface elements, lexical elements, words here and there, which comes into every language, and they have nothing to do with the fundamental grammatical structure of Egyptian language, which is African.
Egypt also brings us to the third wave of African migration. This took place in and around the 25th dynasty, and probably during the reign of this man, Taharqa. Now, before we tell you about the migration, let's talk about the people. It's important to remember that the country of Egypt is in Africa. Its original people were Africans. They described themselves as black and were described as having black skin and woolly hair by noted Greeks and Romans. Any doubts about their racial heritage can be removed by looking at these stone photographs. You can also see some of the same faces in Mexico.
The Olmec heads are kind of an embarrassment in that they've widely and for a long time been recognized as looking black. They don't look like the typical, we've all seen these Aztec figures with the long noses and very hatchet-faced people. The Olmec heads, on the other hand, are sort of wide and oblong and with flat noses and thick lips and you know, very black looking.
How do you explain them getting there?
I don't.
Dr. van Sertima says the ancient Africans sailed to the New World in boats such as these. Built of reed, able to hold more than 50 people, they could move incredibly fast.
The catamaran in the Pacific, they have found these jointed canoes, which are not really canoes. The canoe is a misnomer, jointed boats that were extremely sturdy, far sturdier than the Asiatic boats. And they found one of them with 48 men, 24 rowing, 24 resting, which could cross so fast, it could move from Puerto Rico to Venezuela in a single day. Africa has two of the longest rivers in the world, the Nile and the Niger. They spent more time on those waters than they spent on other roads. They had about 12 types of ships on the Niger, not even counting the Nile, which had 3,000 years of shipbuilding. It gave its ideas to the Phoenicians, who were the great navigators of the early world. You find, for example, on the Indian Ocean, the Mughals of India were so impressed by African ideas about the sea and their ships that they made them admirals of the Indian Ocean, of people known as the cities, and African seagoing people were made admirals of the Indian Ocean by the Mughals of India. The Chinese report Africans were bringing elephants to them in ships to the court of China 2 centuries before Columbus. You can't take elephants across the Indian Ocean in a dugout.
But the Africans of Egypt's last cultural dynasty also sailed the seas in smaller vessels such as these, a feat Atlanta cardiologist Dr. Arthur Lee knows about personally.
Abu Bakr had made the crossing probably 1311 with a fleet of 400 ships. He was a king in Mali, and there were other voyages who made it earlier. If you're from, say, Spanish Sahara, you have to get out offshore about 100 miles to get into the region of the Northeast trades. When I made the trip, I started out from the Canary Islands, and we were in Grand Canary. We left in the evening, about 10, about 4 hours sailing time, heading due south. We picked up the Northeast trades, and we carried them all the way right into the Caribbean. It's a real easy trip. Take it some time.
Doctors Lee and Van Sertima say these African travelers were able to catch cross currents in the Atlantic to bring them back and forth. Dr. Van Sertima also says certain types of plants, which were a hybrid of North American and African origin, grew in Africa before Columbus came. These plants further support the world travel theory. And then there's the matter of maps.
What is extraordinary about this map is that it shows the correct latitude and longitudinal coordinates between the African Atlantic coast and American Atlantic coast. Two other things are very extraordinary about it, that it's only 1 degree off from modern maps. No map produced in Europe before the space age has that accuracy. And 150 years after Columbus, nobody could have produced such a map because it is recorded in encyclopedias of Europe that longitude had not been discovered and was undiscoverable. That is as late as 150 years after Columbus. What this map does is that it shows the Atrato River in Colombia mapped accurately. Nobody had ever mapped that. And it shows that somebody had come up that jungle river, the Amazon, because the Amazon River is mapped for so many miles. It had never been mapped. So that you do not find, in the Columbus period, you do not find that kind of mapping. You do not find those places mapped at all. In fact, you do have about 100 years or so after Columbus, you may find one or two things, but they do not come even close in terms of their accuracy and sophistication.
The belief is that, people just came to the continent and we didn't go anywhere. We just sat there. Okay? And so it was very difficult to get people to take a look at what Ivan Van Sertima and other people have said and written. And I cannot say right now that everybody believes it, but we did get agreement on the fact that they are going to look for ways of showing that in the curriculum so that people understand that Africans have been around the world. And they did it prior to Columbus. Would you believe that?
The next major wave of migration from Africa probably took place around the 6th century A.D. At this time, Persia's Cambyses began to destroy everything in his path, including the 3,000-year cultural reign of Egypt. People and priests scattered. Buddhism, Taoism, and the followers of Confucius also all started around this time. If so, it would explain why Buddhism took a strong hold in India, a place where blacks had lived for centuries.
So, for example, in India today, you have 160 million black people with straight hair.
But all the regular, what we call Afro-Asian.
I've seen the blackest people I've ever seen in India. Really? I mean, black people. Black people who were so black, one old man I saw, I couldn't take my eyes off. He must have thought there was something wrong with me because I kept staring at this brother because I'd never seen a person that black, that beautiful before. I mean, just a shiny black with gray hair. Magnificent.
But there's actually no place in the world you can travel and not find indigenous African populations. The Negritos of the South Seas. We've already talked about the Olmecs of Mexico. Even when Viking Eric the Red went to Iceland, he found Africans. We explained how Africans transported elephants to China as part of a 2,000-year trading partnership these two groups enjoyed. Africans are also described in places visited by ancient Greeks. They're even in Siberia and among the islands of Fiji and Samoa.
And the people of West Africa obviously were the Africans who came to the New World.
Of West Africa?
Of West Africa.
Tell me who they were and how they got here.
These were the people from what Mali obviously stretched closer to the sea. Now, Harold Lawrence, who named Kofi Wangara, has done something on this in a book called African Explorers in the New World.
Those are the African people who have left descendants. Then there are other groups with African names who may have also existed but no longer have descendants.
When we talk about culture, when we talk about the historicity of Saudi Arabia, you're telling me that there were several original cultures? Who were these people? What do we know about them?
Correct. What people don't realize about Saudi Arabia is besides we have several cultures. We have Nabatean cultures. We have villages that we discovered in Al-Fao to the south of Saudi Arabia. The most prominent of the pre-Islamic civilizations in Saudi Arabia were the Nabateans. And most people don't know who these people are in looking at us from the West. But everybody knows, for instance, what Petra and Jerash is. The Nabateans are the same people. They controlled the spice routes and the trade routes inside the peninsula, and especially along the Red Sea coast. And one distinctive characteristic they have is that they built their villages in rock formations. And in Saudi Arabia, we have several of those that have been very beautifully preserved. And for instance, where we stand now would be very similar to what you would find in Madain Saleh or in Al-Fao to the south. Those cultures existed or were thriving in Saudi Arabia between 3000 BC all the way to approximately 1000 BC. One interesting characteristic about Saudi Arabia, especially in its relationship with Africa, geographically, is you find very similar characteristics, let's say, traditions that exist on one side of the Red Sea with those that exist on the other side of the Red Sea.
For example?
For example, the traditions of the fishermen in Tehama, which is the southern part of Saudi Arabia along the Red Sea, are very similar to those of the Sudanese fishermen and the Ethiopian fishermen. Even a lot of the racial characteristics of the East Africans are very similar to some of the people in Tehama in Saudi Arabia. And Tehama again extends from the southern end of Saudi Arabia into Yemen, and it's essentially the coastal plain. Their diets are very similar, their architecture is very similar, and so forth.
Before it was called Ghana, there were people living in that area called the Gadamantes, and we meet them in Herodotus' work because he mentions them as Africans who went to war using a three-wheeled chariot. Herodotus was wrong. Coming from Europe, he think everything that moved is a weapon of war. It was a utility wagon that they used to bring farm products in from the field.
Today, when we say the word Ghana, we think of modern-day Ghana.
Well, no part of modern-day Ghana was any part of the geography of ancient Ghana. And yet the name of modern Ghana is legitimate because the population of modern Ghana originally migrated from the area of ancient Ghana.
Of course, migrations took place on the African continent also. After the fall of Kemet, other African civilizations sprung up. In part 5 of this series, we talked about the kingdoms of Malai, Ghana, and Songhai. But we did not discuss the builders of these magnificent ruins in Zimbabwe, the greatness of old Tanzania, or the kingdom of the Ashanti, an African principality the British could not subdue until neighboring African kingdoms joined the fight. And as always, to really understand the topic, which is African migration, you have to take the time to highlight specific African kings.
We got to deal with Songhai. What happened to Songhai?
Okay.
What happened to Songhai after the death of Soni Ali, 1492, the coming to power of Muhammad Abubakar Ituri, 1493, and when he came to power, he's a commoner now. He had to dispose the weak son of Soni Ali. And on his way to his inauguration, the sister of the son said, "Say it is not he. Say he has not done this to my brother." And she called him throne stealer, usurper, thief, ashler. And he stopped and said, "I will not let the mournings of this weak woman disturb me. Henceforth, this is the name of my dynasty. Call me usurper, thief, throne stealer. Call me Ashler."
In other words,
he created the Ashler dynasty, and he is known in history as Ashler the Great, Muhammad Ashler the Great. He instituted certain reforms that are still being used today.
Such as?
The classification of people in the army based on what they were best suited to do. He found a naval a fleet that can move from the water to the land. He's the forerunner of what we now know as amphibian warfare. He found the basic classification now used in the Army. All of this was studied by the Germans, who made a strong study of African military techniques. It was studied by the Germans, and America picked it up from the Germans. They knew about all of this when they were saying we had no history. They knew about our history.
In part 5 of this series, we also showed you pre-European West African written languages and their similarity to the hieroglyphs of Kemet. If similarity in writing exists, it stands to reason West and North Africans had the same advanced means of travel the East Africans had. And that means Africans sailed the Mediterranean on into Europe.
There's a strong possibility there was a blackness in the Irish, and there was a black dynasty in Hawaii. LeGrand Craig has done some work on that, and there was a black strain in the Philippines, and there was some black emperors of China. We quite forget that prejudice based solely on color is comparatively new.
500 years old, you say?
Approximately, but prejudice based on religion and culture is as old as man.
The writings of historian J.A. Rogers confirm this, and British archaeologist David McRitchie documents as late as the 10th century 3 all-black provinces existing in Scotland. He also labels King Alban of the 10th century, also known as Kenneth or Dubna, a black man. Welsh tradition says in 1631 a black pirate named Ali Crusa attacked and carried off the daughter of Sir Thynne O'Driscoll. But not all Africans came to Europe as raiders. Some came as conquerors.
We'll call that the royal wave of African migration. And to discuss this migration, we have to specifically talk about the Moors and the Berbers. There are no two people more qualified to discuss those topics than Dr. Ivan van Sertima and Dr. John Henrik Clark. Who then were the Moors, and why did the Portuguese and Spanish hate them so much?
Well, the Moors controlled Spain and Portugal, but the Portuguese freed themselves from the domination in 1240. They hated them because they were foreigners who were ruling over them.
Were the Moors Arab or black?
They were a mixture, but mainly black. The word Moor came into the language meaning blackamoor. And when the English speak of marshlands or dark places, they speak of it today as the Moors.
In other words, the negative connotation came from domination.
Yes.
Okay.
But the Moors introduced a lot of things into Spain. They gave Spain the greatest material culture it ever had before.
Were the Moors basically out of that Moroccan area, or were they from
No, they're out of the Senegamia area, and out of the area now marked on the map as Mauritania.
Okay.
And they were descended. LeBlanc and Halle Bourguiba's book on the Moors and on the conquest, she says the army was as black as ink. The general was blacker still. What made the general seem to be blacker than the rest? He was the only one riding a white horse.
On the edge of the Industrial Revolution, when Europe had been in a dark age, came the Moors. Who were these Moors? They're a mixed bag, yes. They were not all black African, but of the 7,000 troops that attacked Europe, 6,000 were black Africans. They included Berbers. They're both blue-eyed Berbers as well as black Berbers. The Smiths among the Berbers are all black, the metal workers. The people who were involved in metal smelting are the black Berbers.
And their reign in Spain and Portugal lasted until a surrender. Besides physical description, we have other clues that the Moors were black, most of them verbal.
The Romans and Greeks gave surnames to people to either describe how they looked or to explain their place of birth. To the Romans and Greeks, then, the words Niger and Fuscus both meant dark-skinned. Another word, Afer, meant from Africa. Moor has its roots in the Greek word moros, which means black, and then there's also the Roman word moros, which also means black. The Greeks also used the word Ethiops to describe black people, and that became synonymous with the word Moor.
The Latin word for black is afer. Moros is probably an African word. From it we get surnames such as Moore, Morrison, Murray, Tanamore, as in Tawny Moore, Mauer, Moro. You get the drift. Anybody with a Moore sound in their name more than likely had African ancestry at some point in time. The word Niger also denotes African ancestry and has probably become one of the most misused words in African history. The writer Claudian describes as Moors those who lived next to the waters of Jur, which he said overflowed its banks like the Nile. From that, many blacks of antiquity came to be called Niger, later Niger or Nigritia. It's a word in any form that describes heritage and antiquity, no matter how it's pronounced. You can see the same heritage in the word blackamoor. It was something that inspired pride in many European families, so much so that literally thousands have the word Moor, Maurice, Fitzmaurice, or, in German, Schwarz, black, in their family crest. In fact, in the Romance of Morian, a King Arthur legend, Sir Morian was described as all black, his head, his body, his hands, all black, saving his teeth. And to quote, Moors are black as burnt brands, but in all that man would praise in a knight, he was fair after his kind. In him was not unsightly. He was taller than any other knight by half a foot. End of quote. Many of the Moors settled in Germany after their expulsion from Spain and Portugal. Many married into German royalty, which may explain why this woman, Charlotte of Mecklenburg, shows an obvious African heritage. Charlotte was Queen of England from 1744 to 1818, married to George III.
The words, the crests, the migrations, the conquerors are all incredible contributions to human history. We don't know about them because they're usually not taught in our schools. But that's changing. To help that change take place more quickly, we also need to document the 2,000-year assault on African history and African heritage. We'll do that in the next edition of African American Culture, A Second Look. I'm Marty Chitwood.
You cannot consciously oppress a consciously historical people.
Major history is never truly lost. History is only lost when we lose it. If we allow ourselves to forget, then it is truly lost. Nothing is lost that is contained in consciousness, and even in the ground. When we had thought that we had forgotten it all, that it was truly lost, we find that the shattered world of Africa can be pieced together again.
The 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
The Negro would appear to stand on a lower evolutionary plane than the white man and to be more closely related to the highest anthropoids. The characteristics are length of arms, a heavy, massive cranium with large arches, flat nose depressed at the base. In one characteristic, the texture of hair, the white man stands in closer relation to the apes than does the Negro.
British historian Arnold Toynbee, author of A Study of History, 1934.
It will be seen when we classify mankind by color. The only race that has not made a creative contribution to any civilization is the black race.
Albert Schweitzer, 1961.
With regard to the Negro, I am your brother, but your elder brother.
But you have to understand, these three men didn't hold isolated opinions. This quote, questioning the need to increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, comes from one of the fathers of our country, Benjamin Franklin. We all know that another founding father, Thomas Jefferson, owned slaves, but he put his feelings about those slaves in writing when he voices his suspicions that blacks are inferior to whites in the endowments of body and mind. Unlike Franklin, Jefferson also had a low opinion of Native Americans, claiming they were weak with no family ties. And Abraham Lincoln may have issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but not for reasons of equality. He says while the two races do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And he says he, as much as any other man, is in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.